The morning Britain never truly believed it would see arrived under a sky heavy with silence. The palace gates, usually alive with ceremonial movement and disciplined order, felt different, still, almost suspended in time. Inside the royal residence, everything had changed, yet nothing had been publicly announced in the way the world expected. There were no grand proclamations, celebratory fanfare. Instead, there was an unsettling calm, the kind that precedes a storm no one is fully prepared for. Prince William stepped into the role that had been anticipated for years, yet never emotionally accepted by those closest to the crown. Today, however, anticipation was no longer the word. It was reality. Prince William walked through the long corridor of the palace with a measured pace, his expression unreadable. Every step echoed not just authority, but finality. The weight of monarchy had been inherited before. This time it felt different. He was not stepping into his father's shadow. He was stepping beyond it. Behind closed doors, the first emergency council had already begun assembling. Senior advisors moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with anyone who seemed uncertain. The transition had not unfolded with the softness many had expected. Instead, it felt sharp, precise, and unsettlingly immediate. And at the center of the quiet storm was Queen Camilla. Queen Camilla had reportedly been informed only hours earlier that the structure of influence within the palace was shifting. Not abolished. Not removed, but redefined in a way that left very little room for interpretation. Those closest to her described the moment as emotionally frozen, as if the air itself had tightened around her family. Her relatives, who had grown accustomed to a certain proximity to royal influence, were suddenly faced with an unfamiliar reality. The corridors they once moved through with ease now felt restricted. Conversations that once carried weight now carried hesitation. Even staff members who previously offered polite familiarity now responded with formality that bordered on distance. It was not hostility, it was change. And change inside the monarchy is rarely gentle. William's first official act was not a speech, nor a public appearance. It was a restructuring order delivered internally, distributed across senior departments within minutes of confirmation. The message was brief, direct, unambiguous. The palace, as it had functioned for decades, would now operate under a revised chain of authority. No leaks were intended. But nothing inside the royal household ever truly stays silent for long. Within hours, whispers spread through the corridors. Certain long-standing advisors found themselves reassigned. Others were quietly informed that their roles would no longer align with the future direction of the crown. The phrasing was diplomatic. The meaning was unmistakable. In a private chamber away from the main offices, tension reportedly rose for the first time. Camilla's family, who had arrived expecting reassurance, instead encountered uncertainty. Conversations that were meant to be comforting became strained. One source described the atmosphere as a room where nobody wanted to be the first to speak truthfully. There was confusion, then disbelief, and finally silence. Not because nothing was being said, but because too much was being understood at once. William, however, remained composed. Those who observed him closely noted that he did not appear angry. He did not appear vengeful. Instead, he appeared focused, as if executing a plan that had already been written long before the moment arrived. A senior court insider described his demeanor as controlled inevitability. By midday, the palace had begun to settle into its new rhythm. Staff adjusted quickly, not out of fear but recognition. The shift was unmistakable. Authority had changed hands in a way that did not require explanation, but the emotional impact was far from contained. Inside private quarters, Camilla was said to have withdrawn from immediate engagements. Not in protest, not in refusal, but in reflection. Those close to her suggested she was attempting to process the speed at which everything had shifted. The balance she had known, carefully maintained for years, was no longer intact. Meanwhile, Camilla's extended family found themselves navigating unfamiliar social terrain. Invitations that once felt routine now carried uncertainty. Access points that were once informal now required formal request. Even conversations with palace staff became measured, cautious, and brief. The shock was not in what had been taken away. It was in how quietly it had happened. No confrontation, no public disagreement, no dramatic rupture. Just structure. And structure, when changed at the top, reshapes everything beneath it. By early afternoon, William held his first closed briefing with senior royal advisors. The doors remained shut for nearly 2 hours. No official transcript was released, but accounts from those present suggested the tone was firm, strategic, and forward-facing. The focus, according to insiders, was stability, not sentiment. There was reportedly one moment during the meeting where the conversation paused as William addressed the core expectation of his reign: unity without confusion, tradition without stagnation, and authority without ambiguity. Those present said the room felt heavier after that statement. Outside the palace walls, speculation had already begun to grow. Royal watchers debated whether the changes were symbolic or permanent, whether this marked a soft restructuring or a definitive reset of influence within the monarchy. But inside the palace, speculation meant very little. Action was already underway. By late afternoon, staff rotations were finalized, security protocols were reviewed, internal communications channels were updated. Every adjustment reinforced the same message. The institution had entered a new phase. And at the center of it all stood William, no longer preparing to lead, but already leading. Yet beneath the structure, beneath the protocol, beneath the disciplined silence of royal tradition, something more human was unfolding. Camilla's family, still reeling from the rapid shift, were described as visibly unsettled, not because they had been publicly humiliated, but because they had not been prepared for how quickly familiarity could disappear within the monarchy. One moment they were inside the circle. The next they were standing just outside it, still respected, still acknowledged, but no longer central. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, carried enormous weight. As evening approached, the palace lights illuminated the corridors with their usual golden glow. But the feeling inside had changed. The institution had not collapsed. It had not fractured. It had simply turned a page so decisively that those still reading the previous chapter struggled to keep up. William's first day as king was not marked by chaos. It was marked by control. And for many inside the royal circle, control was far more unsettling than chaos ever could be. As night began to settle over the palace, the atmosphere shifted again, this time from controlled order into something closer to quiet uncertainty. The corridors that had been busy with disciplined movement earlier in the day were now nearly empty, broken only by the occasional footsteps of guards and staff trying to maintain normal rhythm in a place that no longer felt entirely normal. Inside one of the private wings, the emotional weight of the day finally caught up with those who had been holding it back. Prince William remained in continuous consultation with his closest senior aides. Even as the formal duties of the day wound down, his attention did not. Documents were reviewed again. Decisions were double-checked. Nothing was left vague. Those who observed from a distance noted that he was not rushing the transition. He was sealing it. There was a growing understanding among staff that this was not a temporary adjustment. It was a foundational shift in how authority within the monarchy would now function. Elsewhere in the palace, the emotional contrast was far more visible. Queen Camilla was said to have spent much of the evening in private reflection, away from formal engagements. Those close to her described the mood as restrained, not broken, but deeply contemplative. The events of the day had not removed her position, but they had reshaped its boundaries in ways that were still sinking in. For her extended family, the shock had evolved into something more difficult to define. It was no longer just surprise, it was adjustment. Roles they once assumed to be stable had shifted overnight. Conversations that used to happen casually now required careful timing. Even their presence within palace spaces felt different, not unwelcome, but newly defined. One insider described it simply, nothing is forbidden. But nothing is assumed anymore. By late evening, whispers inside the palace corridors began to quiet. Initial tension of rapid change gave way to a slower realization that the structure had already been set. What remained now was adaptation. William, however, was not done. A final internal directive was issued before midnight, focused not on personnel but on tone. It outlined how the monarchy would present itself moving forward. Less fragmentation in messaging, fewer informal influence channels, and a clearer separation between ceremonial presence and internal decision-making. It was subtle on paper, but inside the institution, its meaning was enormous. It signaled a monarchy that would speak with one voice, and that voice unmistakably was his. As the palace finally grew quiet, there was a sense among senior staff that they had witnessed the beginning of something irreversible. Not a rupture, but a recalibration of power that would define the next era of the crown. Outside, the public remained unaware of the full extent of the internal changes, but inside, everyone understood one thing clearly. The first day of reigns are rarely about celebration. They are about definition. And Prince William had defined his reign without hesitation. The monarchy had not been shaken, it had been reshaped. And somewhere within that reshaping, Camilla's family, still processing the speed and precision of it all, were left with a lingering realization that would take far longer than a single day to fully absorb. Nothing in the palace would ever operate on old assumptions again, and as the lights dimmed across the royal residence, one final thought lingered in the silence. This was only the beginning.